Where's the naked juggler?
So good evening. We are really honored to have you, Secretary Duncan,
Arne, not Secretary.
Arne, okay, for this conversation. We've been spending a lot of time today talking about the future of learning, and we'd love to have a conversation with you about human capital. And I asked a lot of people here and in preparation what word comes to mind when I say Arne Duncan. And here's some of the things they said. Don't worry, it's not bad.
I'll walk out quick.
Tall. Head of school. Basketball fanatic. Proud Chicagoan. Is that how you pronounce it? Chicagoan. Passionate about creating pathways for all students. Secretary of Education under Obama. So what people might not know about you is that you're doing really interesting work now in Chicago, specifically focused on addressing violence in communities and with a special focus on black men aged 17 to 24. You've been quoted as saying, "I realized that my friends who went to college didn't end up shot or dead, while my friends who didn't go to college did." Can you help us make the connection between your work in education over the past 7 years and your current work in Chicago trying to stem violence?
Sure, and to take this back a little ways, grew up in Hyde Park, which is middle-class integrated part of Chicago. My dad taught at the University of Chicago for 40 plus years until he passed, and we grew up on that campus basically. And I was born in 64, and my sister in 67, my brother in 70, but in 61, my mother started an inner-city tutoring program that was literally, it was less than 2 miles from where we lived. We could actually walk some days. But 47th Street at that point was the dividing line between sort of middle-class integrated Hyde Park and all black, all poor, pretty violent North Kenwood, Oakland. Her program was at 46 in Greenwood. And it was a formative experience for my sister and brother and I. My mother did that work for 52 years until her health gave out. And we all tried to follow in her footsteps in various ways. Growing up in her program, growing up starting to play basketball in the neighborhoods, losing friends when you're 13, 14, 15, that shapes you and honestly scars you in some ways. They're a little bit hard to talk about. And some of these guys were guys that frankly protected me and kept me safe. And it was the dividing line. And I think we're all here because we're passionate about education for a whole host of reasons. But in communities like that, the fork in the road is not just about education, which is important. It's not just about economic opportunity. It is also sometimes life and death. And that was unfortunately true. Fast forward to run the Chicago Public Schools for 7.5 years before going to DC. Never enough progress. You always want to do more and go faster, but some things that I'm really proud that we were able to do, and we've seen continued graduation rates continue to climb and more students going to college. But during my 7.5 years leading Chicago Public Schools, on average, we had a child killed every 2 weeks due to gun violence. And that was by far the hardest part of my job, and never got easier. In fact, got harder and harder. And going to those funerals and going to those kids' homes and going to classrooms, there's an empty desk, and trying to make sense of the senseless was extraordinarily tough. And many of those families I got close to and still very, very close to now, and some of those kids were killed 10, 11 years ago. And a lot I missed about Chicago. I went to DC. The one thing I just totally, in hindsight, extraordinarily naively, I thought violence couldn't get worse in Chicago. Like I thought we were at the rock bottom. In the truth, and we can talk about why, for a whole host of reasons, things got a lot worse in Chicago. So, just one, couple stats that are just horrific. I talk about over 7 years losing a child every 2 weeks due to gun violence. last school year in Chicago, so last September to June, 40 weeks, 59 kids were killed. And these are kids in school, and over 360 shot. There's one fantastic charter school that actually helped to start 20 years ago in North Lawndale College Prep, where last school year alone, 17 kids were shot. So one high school, 17 kids shot. And you sort of think about what that's like. And I visited that school a couple months ago, and that was an unbelievable experience, talking to an auditorium full of kids and feeling that grief and pain and anger. So it's a long way of saying, coming back home, just wanting to help out and wanting to make a difference. This is a crisis facing the city. And just for the national perspective, Chicago's the third largest city. New York and LA are larger. Chicago has more homicides than New York and LA combined. We had 760 last year, almost 4,000 shot. For us to just, in a perfect world, we would get to 0. It's probably a little unrealistic, just to be normal, just to be average and be in line relative to the population of New York and LA. We'd have to go from 762 to 150. So we'd have to have a 600 reduction in body count, about an 80% cut. So we could cut it in half and still be double what other cities are. So we are that abnormal. We were that far from where we should be. So just trying to work directly with the guys who are most likely to shoot or be shot. Unfortunately, that is 80% of those shooting or being shot are young black men, 17, 24, and that's where we're concentrating. There are 15 neighborhoods in Chicago that are producing the vast majority of violence, south and west side, so that's where we're focused.
Well, I've heard you say that you, despite these grim statistics, that you remain hopeful, and that when you talk one-on-one with these young men, you see citizens, productive citizens. You see men who have made a, quote, rational choice, even though that choice is violent, and you wanted to work to give them an option for a different rational choice.
Yeah, it's fascinating and unbelievably humbling work. We're making big mistakes every day and learning from them, but we started a little over a year ago with one cohort of guys. Cohort for us is 20 or 30 guys, and we try and build a brotherhood and camaraderie and bring guys who are actually shooting at each other together and work through that stuff, because all this stuff is so proximate. It's very, very tight in neighborhoods. So we now have 6 cohorts of guys going 3 South Side, 3 West Side. And every guy's story is different, but many, not all, many at about the age of 12 or 13 became the men of their homes. And mom was on crack or an alcoholic, dad was locked up or gone, and they had to make some money. And all of us in rooms like this are absent from their lives. We're not present. And there's one guy who's present, and that's the guy in the street corner. And so they go get a job. That guy is always hiring. And that inevitably leads towards a life of selling drugs and the violence associated with it. So I don't judge anymore. I have a younger sister and brother. Obviously, I had none of those challenges, but if I had to fend for them, I can't say I would have made a radically different choice. My youngest guy said, guy who started selling drugs early said he started selling at 9 years old. And he said, Arne, that was really hard to do. And I'm like, I bet it was. And you ask another guy, why'd you go do that? He said, I just got tired of hearing my mother cry at night. I had to go do what I had to go do. And so people say sometimes, oh, it's great you're giving them a second chance. I always say, I don't think we're necessarily giving a second chance, but I think we're often given a first chance. They never had a first chance. And they made a rational choice at 9 or 11 or 13 or 14, and they're making a second very rational choice at 17, 18, 22, 24 to make some money in the legal economy. And we work through lots of trauma and social emotional issues and counseling, guys who get into high school diplomas and transition them from the street economy to the legal economy. But these are amazing leaders. They are survivors. They have a resilience a lot of us in this room can't begin to match. We talk about post-traumatic. A lot of these guys have lived with trauma from the day they were born. Somehow they've survived, and they are going to, I'm 100% convinced, lead our city where we need to go. Last thing I'll say is, people ask, how do you find them? We've had a waiting list for every cohort of guys.
Waiting list.
There's no shortage of guys looking to get out of the life. It is so dangerous. It's so violent. They're getting shot at. The police are chasing them. And no one's getting rich on the streets. No one's making any money. And we're paying $12, $13, $14 an hour, and that's more than enough. So call it $25,000, $30,000 a year. Jail sale is 55 or 60. Every homicide costs the city 1.3 million, 1.4 million. So I can make a pretty good ROI case that this is the right thing to do.
Well, you're speaking to a group of ed tech entrepreneurs people from traditional education industries, publishing. You're talking to people who are financing educational reform. You're talking to charter management, organization leaders. What advice do you have for us as we think about the role technology could play in education, as you think about the trauma that many of the kids whom we serve come into school with that maybe we're not so proximate to?
Yeah, I think there are a couple different pieces to that. It's a really thoughtful question. First is we think about sort of individual learning plans, the personalized learning. Obviously, I'm a huge fan of that. I think we all are. This idea of sort of a personalized social and emotional plan, and how do we help meet kids where they are? And I say, if kids are hungry, it's hard to learn. If they are living in fear, it's hard to learn. One of the guys on my staff who was a former gang leader who created lots of violence in the community. He's been shot 6 times. But he saw he found his mother dead, who was killed by his stepfather, and he said, "There's no one reached out to me." So he had all this rage, and he went out and inflicted as much pain on the community as he could. And so if we're not walking with these young men and women, if we don't move outside our comfort zones, then we're just talking a foreign language. We're not even in the game. And so the other thing I'll say is I think technology can be a great equalizer. It can also exacerbate the divide between the haves and the have-nots. So if we're not thinking deeply and seriously about equity, if we're not thinking deeply and seriously about race, we're actually exacerbating the divide in our country, which scares the heck out of me, because that divide now is, as people here know, globally competitive, knowledge-based economy. Those without are just we're moving towards a caste system.
Yeah.
And if we are perpetuating that or exacerbating that, then we're actually hurting, not just hurting kids, but hurting our democracy.
So in May of 2017, the U.S. Government Accountability Office investigators found that between the year 2000 and 2014, both the percentage of K-12 public schools in high poverty and the percentage comprised of mostly African American or Hispanic students grew significantly, more than doubling from 7 to 15,000 schools. And the percentage of all schools with so-called racial or socioeconomic isolation grew from 9% to over 16%. What's more, such schools, investigators found, offered disproportionately fewer math, science, and college prep courses, and had higher rates of students who were held back in 9th grade, suspended, or expelled. Do you believe that the average American understands the connection between strengthening our democracy, which you just referenced, by creating healthy and sustainable communities, and the school and life success of kids who don't look like their own kids?
Yeah, well, I can't speak for the country, I'll speak for myself. And a lot of the data came from our Office of Civil Rights that did this massive data collection. And you think you know some of this stuff. But I remember a couple of years ago we found, and I had no clue, and we announced with Eric Holder that across the country, the vast majority of pre-K kids who were being suspended and expelled, which I didn't know we were suspending and expelling 3 and 4-year-olds. Pre-K, I mean, It's not, you can laugh, it's really cry. They were young boys of color, black and brown boys. And you talk about a punch to the gut. I mean, I was stunned. Wow. Again, this is my life's work, and I had no clue. So people don't like when I talk about the school to prison pipeline, but it is real in the fact that it actually starts with 3 and 4-year-olds. And not that 3 and 4-year-olds don't come to pre-K with some very real challenges, because I know they do. But is the answer to kick them out and put them back to wherever the harm or damage is being done to them? Or is the answer to figure out with a social worker or a counselor what's going on and what supports we can provide for them? So, again, we in the education space sometimes, found the enemy and it was us. You got to look in the mirror, and that's us. And we got to own that. And so whether it's segregation, whether it's massive disparities in access to AP classes, STEM classes, we are so, again, education, just like technology, education can and should be a great equalizer, but it is fundamentally not equal. It is fundamentally unfair. I mean, our K-12 system is based upon property taxes. Property taxes favors the wealthy. There's not a national play here. When I ran the Chicago Public Schools, we got less than half the money per year for my kids who were 85% live below the poverty line, 90% students of color. We had less than half the money each year the kids that lived 5 or 6 miles north of us in Winnetka and Wilmette. We sued the state, we lost. State recently made some changes, but the massive inequities in virtually every state in the nation exacerbates these divides.
So what do we do about this inequity? You know, we're kind of Sybil. We're like Sybil. We say that we live in a post-racial environment because we had a black president, and then you read Ta-Nehisi Coates, the first white president. We tell ourselves that the access to technology is becoming ubiquitous, yet we know, I was just talking to a leader at a CMO who said that they had to wait 3 months in LA to get Wi-Fi. So we pride ourselves in this room in being data-driven and being so aware of the data and the facts, yet we can't even come to agreement on matters of equity or matters of access. And I was humbled. I'm a graduate of the University of Virginia, and I was stunned when I saw what happened in Charlottesville, when I saw white supremacists show up, not even thinking that they had to wear a hood. So I'm wondering, do you believe that we're in a different place because of some of the trying not to be, when I say I can't breathe, everybody conjures an image here. Are we where we are now because we fundamentally do not value black and brown lives as much as we value white lives?
Absolutely is a short answer. And let me just go right back to Chicago real quick. And one stat I didn't give you of talk about homicides, you talked about shootings. So in 2017, if you commit murder in Chicago, there's about a 13% chance you get caught. So 87% of homicides go unsolved. It's something called a clear rate that I'm obsessed on. If you shoot somebody but don't murder them, that's about a 2 to 3% clear rate. So there are no consequences. And the vast majority of people, young people being shot in Chicago, look more like you than like me. I promise you, if those 762 murders were people of my skin color, not yours, that our clear rate would be higher. So beyond a shadow of a doubt, we don't value black and brown lives as much as we value lives of folks that look like me. Again, if you look at funding, educational funding inequities, if you look at lack of access, whether it's to preschool or to AP classes,